Greetings, MIDI heads! Alright, in this video I want to show you how to make your own replacement MIDI dongle, breakout cable, adapter, whatever you want to call it, to use with your Arturia Beatstep. And I should point out, this is only for the vanilla Beatstep model, not for the Beatstep Pro, which uses an entirely different breakout cable. As anyone who has used and subsequently lost one of these things will know, they're not exactly cheap to replace. The cost for a set of 2 replacement cables direct from Arturia is actually quite reasonable, but it's the shipping. That can cost you $30 or more to the US for a tiny cable. Ridiculous. All the parts I use in this video add up to about $6 and your time. Throughout this video, I will be referring to TS and TRS connectors. If you're already familiar with those terms, then just skip ahead a bit while I explain to those who are not. TS and TRS are the common technical terms for the phono jack connectors used in audio equipment. TS stands for tip sleeve, while TRS stands for tip ring sleeve. TRS is commonly used in stereo connections. One element for the left channel signal, one element for the right, and one element for ground. TS is typically used in mono situations. Now I'm talking about audio connections here, but how does this relate to MIDI? So the trend has been to use 1/8" mini jacks in place of full-size DIN sockets for MIDI connections. And not all manufacturers adhere to an exact standard as far as MIDI connection points are concerned. As I mentioned, the Beatstep Pro uses a different standard than the Beatstep. The Beatstep Pro uses a TRS connection for its MIDI dongle. So manufacturers aren't even consistent across their own model lineup. All of this can be pretty confusing when you're trying to shop for a replacement dongle. So all of that is very anecdotally interesting, but what you want to know is, how can I make my own replacement Beatstep dongle so I can save myself $30? Well, enough with the preamble, on with the show. What you will need: 1 mono 1/8" TS mini phono jack, 1 5-pin DIN jack, female, a multimeter, some wire strippers, a 25 to 40 watt soldering iron, and some 03 or 05 solder. I prefer the fully leaded stuff. The lead-free solder I find is a bit tricky to work with, especially on the small work. Now all of this is available at your local electronic supply store. I'm lucky to have an Orvac in my town. If there's no retail outlet close to you, there's always Amazon. I've found that the cheapest way to get a mini phono jack is to buy a splitter cable of some sort. Here I have a mono splitter. The mono signal is to split into 2 wires. But I've also in the past used a stereo splitter. The stereo signal, left and right channels, is split into left and right cables. Both varieties work equally well once the head is cut off, which we'll do right now. We'll trim the head as close to the main jack as possible, and we can discard this, we don't need it. Then we split the cable, so now we have 2 TS cables. So we can make a dongle and a spare from 1 splitter. Yay! So we have a TS cable about 3-4 inches long. That's perfect for our breakout cable. But it does mean there's not a lot of room for error if we have to trim the wire and start again. As Lord Blackadder once said, we're not home to Mr. and Mrs. Cockup. So let's turn on the soldering iron so it's nice and hot by the time we're done with our prep and ready to solder. Okay, first we need to trim back the outer sheathing. About 3/4 of an inch using the wire strippers. Be very careful when doing this, as the copper wire inside is super fragile and you don't want to inadvertently cut it. So take your time and start with the largest opening, and if it's not big enough, not small enough, just not cutting it, then just move down. It's better to start conservatively. There we go. And no wire inside that, so I was careful enough. So then we need to use the wire strippers again to expose the copper wire in the internal sheathing, the inner sheathing there. Once we separate the grounding wires and twist these together, those are twisted together, we now have a very, very thin wire inside this sheath here, and I believe it's that's going to be carrying the signal, so we have to be very careful. And in fact, these strippers are so small, they so I very carefully use the cutters to strip back just about 1/4 of an inch. That's all we need to make the solder. So with the sheathing removed and the wires exposed, we need to determine what wire is what. And so to do that, we'll use our multimeter set to continuity mode. Hold one probe to the tip of the jack, and it doesn't matter which one. Then touch the other probe to one of the wires. The multimeter should beep when a connection is made. If not, touch the probe to the other wire to confirm the connection to the tip. There it beeped, confirming that the tip is connected to the white wire. And just double check, touch the sleeve, and indeed it beeps, there's continuity, the sleeve is connected to the bare wire. So you can see that up close, the tip is connected to the white wire and the sleeve connected to the bare wire. So make a note of that so we don't forget. The MIDI connections are so. With the mating edge, that is the flat bit that plugs into the socket, not the wired end. With that facing us, we can follow this diagram. You'll see the MIDI connections use pins 4 and 5. Pin 4 should connect to the tip, and pin 5 should connect to the sleeve of our jack. So if we disassemble the jack, we can see there's the mating face, and here is where we will make the connections. So pin 4 connects to the tip, pin 5 connects to the sleeve, and the others are not used. So we'll turn the DIN jack around so the solder points are facing you. Make note of which pin is which. Remember, we're not home to Mr. and Mrs. Cockup, so we don't want to forget the pin location is reversed with the back of the jack facing us. Yes, I have been there and done that and had to desolder and start again. Let's get that a little closer. So this is pin 4, pin 5, tip, sleeve, white, bare. Okay? Hopefully that makes sense. So before we begin soldering, we need to make sure that any heat shrink tubing and the DIN jack sheath are placed onto the cable and slid down out of the way. Actually, this looks like it's big enough that we can just leave this until the end. It will slide right over the top. So I'll put that aside for now. But I will, in like reverse order of size, is slide the heat shrink over the jack plug. So we have our cable with the heat shrink sort of slid enough out of the way that I can solder this. Let's zoom in. So we are looking at putting the tip on here and the sleeve I just need a small dab of solder and just again make sure it soaks all the way into the strands of the cable to make a good strong connection. I'm not the greatest solderer. I mean, my work is not clean, but as long as the connection is good. Once the connections are made and cooled down, we must test they're good and correct. It's important to do this before we assemble the shrink and cover. And yes, again, I've been there and done that. It's handy to have a short length of copper wire to insert into the DIN plug to make the continuity test easier. Once again, we use our multimeter and we have a good connection from the tip of the jack to the pin on the MIDI DIN jack. Let's check pin 5. This is the sleeve. Again, we have good connection. Okay, moving on. Then we just need to assemble the jack plug. It's a little fiddly. It snaps into place. And we just crimp the cable clamp around the base of the jack just to hold the wire in place, and that is what the tension is, not pulling on the solder connections. So don't clamp it too tight. We don't want to break the copper wire inside. Okay, so now the heat shrink in this purpose really isn't to protect any of the exposed wiring, because the sort of sheath of the DIN plug takes care of that. This I'm using because the open cable side of the sheath is a little bit larger. It tends to be a little bit loose, and I'd like to create a bit of padding around the wire just to give it something a bit more to grip onto. Okay, and to secure the heat shrink in place, you just need a heat gun. And that is good enough to offer a bit more support. Now we just need to assemble the metal casing. Slide the sheath over the top. And it's proving to be a little bit tricky to get that to snap and stay in place. Okay, and so after a little bit of huffing and puffing and fiddling, the sheath is in place, and the tendency is for the metal casing to kind of snap out of place a little bit, so it's a little bit tricky. Ultimately, what we have is one very cheap DIY MIDI dongle. One thing to point out real quick is that do be sure that this little metal tab is poking through the hole, so when you pull on the jack to remove it, that the cover doesn't slide off. This is really what's locking it all into place. Now, just go plug in your Beatstep and sequence some MIDI. One alternative to this method that you could try is taking a full-size MIDI cable and just cutting the DIN jack off of one end and then soldering a TS jack in its place. There'll be no need for a dongle at all. You can go directly from the Beatstep into your MIDI synth. Okay, cheers for watching. If you found this helpful and or entertaining, please like, subscribe, tell your family, tell your friends. And until next time, bleep bloop.